Cease to hope, and you will cease to fear. That quote is attributed to a philosopher called Hecate, who was a Greek philosopher in the classical era, but none of his texts have survived to this day. Where I read that quote was in another ancient text called Epistulae Morales ad Lucilium, or just Epistulae Morales, or otherwise Letters from a Stoic, written by a Roman philosopher called Seneca. The Epistulae Morales are an absolute classic for a very good reason. And as a side note to anyone listening, I recommend you buy it and read it. I remember the version that I have on my Kindle, I bought for, I think it was 99 pence. And the amount of value it's given me is absolutely incredible. And what Epistulae Morales is the published correspondence between Seneca and one of his friends, Lucilius. They're the letters that he wrote and sent to his friend. And in total, it covers a very broad range of philosophical points, and there are so many lessons you can learn from reading them. It's like listening to the advice. It literally is reading the advice that one of the best philosophers in history would give to a friend. It's incredible, and it has changed my life very much for the better. But I want to focus this episode on outlining how the Stoics faced one of the immensely negative drawbacks of humanity's greatest gift: foresight. And the drawback of this gift can, for some people, unfortunately be anxiety. Humans have the ability to think ahead, to rationally weigh up situations and contemplate future circumstances. This has allowed us to go from what were once very similar to monkeys to putting jet-propelled entities into space, conquer the animal kingdom, and everything else humanity has achieved. But name something, anything, before it was made. It was first a thought. It was then planned, and then it was brought forth into the material world through action. But first, it was a thought. Foresight is a blessing, but it can also be a curse. And perhaps what is unfortunately all too clear to you, dear listener, is that humans have an absolutely terrible tendency to get completely caught up in their own thoughts. You may find yourself riding a whirlwind of your own thoughts completely out of your control sometimes. What you think is going to happen. And the thoughts spiral out of control, taking over the emotion, mood, and in some extreme cases, lives of some people. Think of a time where you were dreading going into work tomorrow because of how you thought your boss was going to treat you, or how difficult the customers were going to be. Think of that feeling in your stomach. Think of how nervous you were for some exam results after you'd completed the exam. And these are some clear examples, but also think perhaps of how scared you are to lose someone in your life. A lover, a friend, a relative. Perhaps your mind takes over you sometimes and forces you into despair, helplessness, fear. Fear. Fear of the future. That's all anxiety is. And so what I want to talk about today is how to cope with this fear how to cope with anxiety. And if you experience it to a greater or lesser extent, the solution is the same. The opening quotes to this episode: cease to hope, and you will cease to fear. What does that make you think? Cease to hope, and you will cease to fear. It kind of appears to be incredibly pessimistic, right? You might have thought, what? Don't hope? What do you mean? Why shouldn't I want nice things to happen to me? Why shouldn't I hope for good luck? Why shouldn't I want good circumstances in the future? That doesn't make sense. But should I want bad things to happen to me? That's a terrible saying. I'm listening to another podcast. Well, here's what it means. And here is what Seneca writes. Hope and fear both belong to a mind in suspense. Whether you are expecting good things to happen or bad things to happen is technically the same thing. You're projecting your expectations, your needs, your wants, your desires into the future. It's the same thing, just the positive aspect which makes you feel good and the negative aspect which makes you afraid. It's the same thing. And in some cases, you're presuming to know what's going to happen to you. And you're suffering now because of it. What you think is going to happen is what's causing your suffering now. And the terrible thing is you're suffering completely in your own imagination. Your mind is in suspense. Think of like a horror movie, when you just know something's coming and you're just bracing for it. Your mind is in suspense of the future, and you're prematurely suffering at the hands of nothing but your own thoughts. So that's something to consider. Whenever you feel anxious about something that you think is going to happen, you must understand you don't know what's going to happen. You're thinking it's going to happen. So that's one thing. But more interestingly, to kind of get to the good stuff here, he also says, fear keeps pace with hope. Fear keeps pace with hope. Meaning, you can only fear things. You can only fear things if you hope for the opposite. Right? Fear keeps pace with hope. The fear you experience is directly correlated to how much you hope for something. A moment ago I said it's the same thing, just the opposites of it. So, for example, the more you hope for a certain outcome, the more afraid you will be that it doesn't happen. Just as the less you care about something, the less you fear it. You see? Fear keeps pace with hope. They don't stand independent from each other. They are the same thing, just the positive and the negative. So to contextualize this, here's what I mean. You can only fear not being invited to a party if you are also hoping to go. You can only be really scared of people's opinions of you if you are really hoping to be liked by them. It is because of this hope you have that you also fear. It is because of this hope you have that you fear. It's the same thing Fear is created by hope. And you can also say vice versa. So that's the issue, right? One, you're thinking ahead and projecting your needs into the future, right? I need this to happen. I hope that this happens. And two, it is because of this attachment that you fear. It is because of this attachment to the future, this hope that you have, this desire, that you fear. It creates the fear. You cannot have one without the other. They exist simultaneously. I can't think of a better word to say other than that right now. They coexist together. Fear creates hope. Hope creates fear. Right? This is what makes you anxious. Your hope. In other words, another one of Seneca's points. You have put yourself in a position where you are dependent on fortune. Dependent on fortune. Fortune meaning how things will play out in life. The force that acts in this world that you have no control over. How other people act. The economy, you could say to an extent, the government, the weather, how people treat you. These things that you cannot control. If you're hoping good things from these things, if you're hoping for good fortune, and you're becoming dependent on good fortune for your good state of mind, you put yourself in a position of dependency on them. You tie your state of happiness to the outcomes of fortune. And this is the source of your anxiety. You have backed yourself into a position where you are hoping for things to turn out in your favor, things that you don't control. Your happiness depends on whether it does or does not happen. This is where you hope that it will and fear if it will not. All right, so that's the diagnosis that the Stoics and ironically the Taoists give to approaching anxiety. That's the diagnosis. That's what it is. Fear creates hope. In the Tao Te Ching, one of the first verses is essentially is creates isn't, and isn't creates is. But that's for another episode entirely. Let's not get too meta here. That's what the Stoics talked about when it came to anxiety. So let's get to talking about how you actually deal with it. Here is how you approach dealing with anxiety. Understand this. Anxiety isn't the disease. Anxiety is the symptom of a disease. Okay, I'm going to say that again because it's pretty important, right? Anxiety isn't the disease. Anxiety is the symptom. Okay, your anxiety doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't happen by itself. It doesn't spring out of nowhere. Anxiety itself isn't the source of your suffering. It's the symptom of your suffering. So when you're thinking of how to deal with anxiety, don't focus on how to treat the symptoms. Focus on how to treat the cause. And the cause is thus. It is the direct result of how attached you are to things. The cause of your anxiety is the direct result of how attached you are to things. And things in that statement can mean anything, right? Anything. Therefore, the solution to your anxiety is to work on developing a healthy relationship to things and not attachments. Right? That's the vague notion of how you cure your anxiety here. You cannot stay clinging on to these attachments and hope just not to fear. That isn't how it works, right? You can't have hope without fear. You must develop healthy relationships to things and not attachments, okay? And that's the vague meta concept here. Cease to hope, and you shall cease to fear. Yes, true, but how do we cease to hope? How can we live a good life, a life of happiness, a life of positivity, without hope? How does that work? What does this mean? Well, here is where we wade into the depths of philosophy. And let me tell you, there is a whole lot of thinking and a whole lot of answering that goes into the reply to that question. But how do we live a happy life, regardless of what happens to us? How do we live a happy life regardless of what happens to us? There are so many things that need to be unpacked in an answer suitable to that question. And that's what all of the future episodes from here on out are going to be addressing too, right? That is essentially the core question that philosophy asks. How do we live a happy life regardless of what happens to us? And for this episode, I'm going to take one piece of that puzzle, and it's a pretty big puzzle, to identify one of the many lessons. It is to manage the attachments we place on our expectations. To manage the attachments we place on our expectations, particularly on things we do not control. Or to phrase that sentence in different ways, do not emotionally depend on that which you cannot control. Do not depend on external events for your own happiness. Do not look to without to fulfill what is within, etc., etc. And this is one of the central concepts of Stoicism. Essentially, through many other lessons which I'm going to be getting to the point of neutrality. Neutrality towards what happens to you. And you get there through not depending on it for your own happiness. Right? The ideal state is neutrality towards what happens to you. Right? Through not depending on fortune. Right? Essentially reducing, ideally removing the dependence on fortune to deliver your happiness. Right? Because you're not attached to what happens, you don't need certain things to happen. You're not too bothered whether they do or they don't. You're neutral. You're good in either case. You're solid. You're independent of fortune. And this place, this state of mind where you aren't dependent on fortune or life, when you aren't dependent on what happens to you and you don't need external things to lift you up and to make sure that you're okay, when you are completely detached from what happens to you, where you don't fear what is to come, where you're free of this burden of anxiety, this place the Buddhists would call nirvana. The Taoists would call it Wu Wei. Christians would call it faith in God's plan. But the Stoics would call it Virtus, which translates to virtue. But it more so implies that it is the highest virtue that you can cultivate. Impartiality to what may unfold, and to embrace it all with a smile, regardless of the ebbs and flows of fortune. Not to mind what the external world does, what fortune may give you. Because you have cultivated this virtue of independence. And what I will be going, like I said a minute ago, what I will be going into in the future is the many, many layers that have to be unpeeled to get to this point. But to focus on your character, to satisfy yourself with what happens to you, even if it isn't as good as you would like it to be. This is the cure of anxiety, removing your dependency on that which you do not control. Cease to hope, and you will cease to fear. So that's the end of the manuscript I've written for this episode. I've improvised a little bit there. And just as a note to my listeners, if you got to the end of the episode, if you enjoy these episodes, please, well, not please, but if you want to, follow me on Instagram at OWC Podcast, where I'm going to be posting a few little extra nuggets of content and obviously updates and announcements, etc., etc., etc. If you want to, check it out. I hope you found some value in what I've just spoken about there. And just to ramble on a bit at the end of the episode here, it's kind of, like I mentioned, there's so much that goes into getting to the place where you are neutral to what happens, to what life throws at you. To get to that point, you can't unpack that in a single podcast episode. And so please stay with me for the following few weeks. I have an episode planned for every week for the next few weeks, and I will be delving further into this point. So thank you for listening. I hope you found some value in it, and good luck with life, I guess.